800-711-6818 and we'll rush your order discreetly packaged to your door. Been thinking about trying Viagra or Cialis? Call U.S. Pharmacy at 800-711-6818 for as little as only $119 for 90 pills. Need your package in a hurry? Call 800-711-6818 and ask about our express shipping option, and we'll rush your order to you as soon as possible. Save money on this little blue or yellow pill you've been wanting to try. Again, 800-711-6818 now. That's 800-711-6818.
Shades of the Titanic with a much better outcome.
The Norwegian Sun cruise ship is back in Seattle 5 days after hitting an iceberg off Alaska. Passenger Dave Morgan got a good look when it happened.
I could actually see the iceberg lifted out of the water and push off to the side of the ship and crash back down into the water. It jarred the ship.
No one was hurt. The Norwegian Sun passed an inspection in Alaska before heading back to the lower 48 at lower speeds. Steve Kathan, CBS News.
A relief for Swiss chocolate fans.
The elegant smoothness and its savory taste can't be resisted by anyone.
Callebaut says an internal investigation has found none of its liquid chocolate contaminated with salmonella at a plant in Belgium was shipped to clients. Yesterday, the factory stopped production. Statement says all equipment will be cleaned and disinfected before it starts up again. Callebaut supplies Hershey, Nestle, and Mondelez. Deborah Rodriguez, CBS News.
WPTV's First Alert Weather on WPSL is brought to you by Seacoast Air Conditioning. Now with a look at our forecast, here's meteorologist Katia Hall.
Your WPTV First Alert forecast. This afternoon, highs in the low 90s, heat index values in the triple digits. We'll see partly sunny skies this afternoon with a 40% chance for inland showers and storms. Tonight, lows in the mid to upper 70s with a few spotty showers into the overnight hours. For the weekend, morning temperatures in the mid to upper 70s, afternoon highs in the low 90s, but feeling like the triple digits with the humidity. We'll see some isolated shower activity near the coast in the morning and a few afternoon inland showers and storms possible. I'm WPTV First Alert meteorologist Katia Hall for WPSL 1590, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
Living in Florida is paradise until your AC breaks down. Seacoast Air Conditioning is family owned and operated for over 40 years. We answer the phones, show up on time, and fix the problem right the first time.
Comfort crisis, don't roast, call Seacoast.
Do you have issues on the job with wages or overtime, family and medical leave, disability issues, discrimination, or sexual harassment? Do you have a landlord and tenant problem or have a contract dispute? Have you been defamed or have your civil rights been violated? Hello, I'm attorney Stuart M. Address, and for more than 30 years, I've been fighting for the rights of everyday people. I believe in aggressive advocacy combined with personalized attention. That means being available to my clients. It means answering emails, sometimes at 3 a.m, and checking my messages over the weekend. It means caring about you. If you want to speak with a lawyer who will not be intimidated and who will actually care about you, call my office, Stuart M. Address, PA, at 772-781-8003, or send us a message through our website at www.stuartaddresslaw.com. We will respond to your calls and messages because we care. Our office is in Stuart, Florida.
You're listening to WSTU Stuart.
This is WPSL Port St. Lucie.
The opinions on this program are those of the program host and guest and not necessarily those of WPSL. WPSL does not endorse products that may be mentioned. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited without written consent of WPSL. Legal questions? Ask a lawyer. Give us a call at 340-1590, 340-1590 here at the studios of WPSL. And Ask a Lawyer with your host, attorney Stuart M. Address.
Good morning. This is Stuart Address for Ask a Lawyer. It's July 1st, 2022. Half the year is now gone. Where did it go? I don't know, because it seems both so fast and so long. All right. There's nothing been going on in the news this week. It's really been a very, very slow news week.
Yeah, nothing happened whatsoever anywhere.
I don't even know what to talk about today. I thought we could talk about, contract law, which I've had on the docket for over a month now, and, what you should be looking out for when you sign contracts. One day we'll get to that. Today's not the day, I don't think. I want to finish up very quickly last week's discussion about how difficult it is to change somebody's mind once they formed an opinion, and then transition into the Roe v. Wade overruling this week by the Supreme Court. But I'm going to handle it in a different way, and we'll see about that, because I think you're looking at me with, we have a caller?
No, not yet. But did you see back in the day in 92 that Joe Biden was against Roe v. Wade? In the wonderful world of videotape.
Yeah. Well, things evolve.
Yes.
All right, so let's finish up with identity politics. I want to give you one illustration of a study that was done showing how difficult it is to get somebody to even be willing to take a chance on listening to material that might cause them to change their mind. There is an article that I had referred to last week where it said a desire for identity consistency may help explain why we've become so uncomfortable engaging with opinions that challenge our beliefs. One recent study found that we are even willing to give up the chance to earn money to avoid reading opinions we disagree with. Participants had the choice to read opinions they agreed with about political topics like same-sex marriage, guns, or abortion for the chance to win $7. Alternatively, they could read opinions they disagreed with for the chance to win $10. About 2/3 of the participants chose to read the opinions they agreed with, giving up the chance to earn more money. And this tendency isn't something you could simply pin on the other political party. The researchers found that both Democrats and Republicans were equally likely to avoid information they disagreed with. So it is incredibly challenging. And this is something that trial lawyers deal with in a courtroom, because although the jurors are told not to form opinions until all the evidence is in, reality shows that jurors have preliminary opinions as soon as opening arguments are done. And from that point on, it is hard to get their brain to filter in evidence that they now disagree with. In fact, the harder you try to convince somebody about something with which they disagree, it creates an echo chamber where people start to only read social media they agree with, only read partisan views and watch partisan news that they agree with, and surround themselves with friends with whom they agree. This can lead to your opinion, or my opinion, becoming even more extreme. A number of psychological studies have shown that group discussions can lead people to hold more extreme beliefs than they would on their own, a phenomenon known as group polarization. Our tendency to surround ourselves with only like-minded opinions may be one of the reasons why Republicans and Democrats are rapidly becoming more polarized. I'll give you an example. I live here in my house and my very liberal Democratic house. Next door to us, across the entire back of their garage, is a Trump flag for Trump in 2024. And these people, my neighbors, have their garage door open all day long. For some reason, maybe this, I don't know where this comes from, but instead of sitting in their backyard where they have a pool and fans, they sit in their garage all day long, you know, on chairs, chit-chatting, drinking beer, what have you. And you can see the back of their garage, you know, all the time, Trump 2024. Now, we have expressed a few words with our neighbors, polite words. Hello, how you doing? But there's never been any effort by either of us to engage in any real discussion. Because it's clear neither of us would agree with the other in any way, shape, or form. And so it's just an illustration that even my neighbor and I prefer to associate with like-minded people. Now, in political circles, it wasn't always this way. Pre-Trump, it was very common for Democrats to have Republican friends and Republicans to have Democrat friends. You disagreed on some policies. That was no big deal. The era of Trump has created intense divisions. Disagreeing on politics creates very often dynamic arguments and possible violence, as we've seen. And so we tend to associate more with those that we agree with. Indeed, it's been found that even getting the facts through to somebody else won't necessarily change their opinion of somebody. Research has shown that correcting misconceptions isn't enough to change behaviors. Studies have found that correcting false beliefs, for example, about Trump caused people to change their belief, but this did not change how much they supported Trump. In other words, while you can get people to understand the facts don't always matter. If your opinions have become deeply ingrained, part of your emotional identity. Somehow you have to get to that to change people's viewpoints, and that is much more difficult to achieve. And maybe one reason why Republicans have been hearing nothing for 4 years, hearing nothing during January 6th committee hearings, and only now possibly having facts get through to them as even Fox has to report on them. Indeed, there is a clip on YouTube that is making its rounds. So I'll get to Charlie in Palm City in one moment. Charlie, hang on. There's a clip circulating YouTube that shows a part of Fox Television reaction to the recent hearing, the surprise hearing of this week. And in the middle, there's one commentator talking about how serious the news was that we had learned that day. And then he finishes up his comment and says, you know, this is something we're going to have to deal with. And then the two primary anchors that are on either side of him just stare there silently. Nobody talks for like 5 seconds. And then the male anchor says, Susan, to you, because he doesn't want to say anything. And Susan says, no, you can go ahead. And it went back and forth one more time before Susan started to talk. I don't know if her name was really Susan. But it was like the two anchors on the side were just sitting there and they didn't know what to do with the information that the guy in the middle said, where he said, you had to take today's hearing seriously, and it posed serious consequences, possibly for Trump. They just didn't know what to do with it because it completely was antithetical to their own viewpoints. You were going to say something, Greg?
There is a funny thing on Facebook. It is Schiff at the congressional hearing saying we have eyewitness reports. And then the picture underneath is Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder. It's hysterical.
That is pretty good. All right, let's go to our caller.
Charlie, you're on.
Hello, Stuart. Hello, Greg.
Hi there, Charlie.
You went far afield from the reason I called, but you had said that Trump's presidency kind of brought on dividing Republicans and Democrats even deeper.
I agree. Yes, that's what I said.
Okay, my contention, it's President Obama's presidency, particularly, I mean, the entire thing when he was kneeling overseas, just about kissing, the Chinese person's feet. But President Obama had a brain. I didn't agree with what he did, but every time there was an incident, for instance, the Harvard professor attempting to break into his own home, and the white police officer stopped and just wanted, sir, could I have identification? And the guy freaked out. Obama took the professor's side every single time. I think that President Obama's presidency gave us President Trump and a really rip-roaring economy. Everybody was happy. That's my.
You always have very interesting comments. I give you that, and I agree with one thing you said. And usually that's what happens. I agree with one thing you said. I don't agree that this thing with Obama kissing the ring. Look, Obama, like every other president,
because I can hear
no,
you.
they all follow protocol. Okay, and different countries, you try to respect their protocol. It doesn't mean that you're becoming subservient to them. So I disagree with all that. Do I agree that Obama's presidency created serious racial strife? No, I don't agree that it created it. I do agree that it brought it out much more, that people did not realize the severity still of racial divide. And I do agree that Obama, well, I don't agree that Trump's policies gave us a great economy. Quite to the contrary. I think it took Joe Biden to come in, and initially with a rescue plan, much smaller than he wanted, to help the economy come back. And it's because the economy came back so fast that we now have a problem. We have an inflation problem, and we also have a problem because Russia invaded Ukraine in terms of food prices, fuel prices. So the combination of the economy coming back so fast after the pandemic, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has led to the negative economic circumstances we find ourselves in, and an even greater likelihood that Biden and the Democrats will suffer serious midterm losses. Beyond that, I don't really agree with your perspectives. Now, I do think that Trump's presidency created these serious divides. When Obama was president, I'm going to use one particular woman in my own temple who was a Trump supporter. When Obama was president, even if we disagreed on policies, and he's very conservative, we were able to talk like human beings and laugh and joke and tease. Wasn't a problem. I've had the same situation with friends, when Bush was president, both Bushes, when Reagan was president. In my whole life, I could have good conversations with people that believed in different political perspectives. It was Trump and the outrageous lying that we heard every single dang day that continued to polarize people. And if you were pro-Trump, you very likely did not want to speak with people who were anti-Trump. And if you were anti-Trump, you really didn't want to converse with people that were pro-Trump. Because inevitably what would happen, the longer Trump was president, was the more cantankerous your discussions would become. For example, there was one particular instance, I don't recall what it was about, but there was one particular instance where Trump had a policy, an administrative policy, that was very, very anti-Jewish. And I remember going to Friday night services at Temple, and we were sitting around after services chit-chatting. And I made a comment like, you can't tell me you still agree with Trump now. And she says, absolutely I do. And me and a few other people looked at her like an absolute shock. And the realization began to set in that we could not talk to this person because we could not communicate in a manner in which either of us would not get angry. And I think that is a hallmark of the Trump presidency. So with that, I'm going to segue into abortion. And I'm not really going to focus on the actual decision that came down last Friday while I was on the air. I'm going to focus on a consequence of the decision and some interesting constitutional issues that will eventually have to be decided, although I can likely predict how they will be decided by a 6-3 conservative court. So let's start this way. There was a case back in 2017. No, I'm sorry. There was a case back in 1963, the United States Supreme Court. Sherbert versus Werner. And this is what essentially happened and what the court decided. Sherbert was fired because she could not work on Saturdays for religious reasons. She subsequently filed for unemployment benefits and was denied. She appealed to the state's Supreme Court, claiming that her denial for unemployment benefits was unconstitutional. She lost in the state Supreme Court, and she filed for appeal in the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court held that denying unemployment benefits imposes a burden on an individual's right to the free exercise of religion and is unconstitutional absent a compelling government interest that is carried out by the least restrictive means available. Now, let's look at what that might really mean in the consequence of abortion. Okay? Somebody has a sincere religious belief regarding abortion, and they're denied an abortion. And eventually their case makes it up to the Supreme Court. Forget for a moment that it's this Supreme Court. Just makes it up to the Supreme Court. If you follow the reasoning in the Sherbert versus Werner case from 1963, the Supreme Court would reject the interference with the ability of the woman to get the abortion because it violates her First Amendment right to the free exercise of her religious beliefs and is therefore unconstitutional absent a compelling government interest that is carried out in the least restrictive means possible. So, spending one more moment on that particular case, the court held that denying unemployment benefits imposes a burden on Sherbert's free exercise of religion, as denying benefits pressures her to sacrifice an important component of her religion. And the court indicated the regulated acts, here the unemployment benefits, must posture a substantial threat to peace, public safety, or order, and Sherbert's objection to working on her Sabbath does not constitute any of the above. And so therefore, she's entitled to her religious beliefs, and the interference by government is unconstitutional. All right, so now, we sort of postulated how that might impact abortion. I thought it was a novel theory. Apparently, it's not. It's a theory that's been discussed for over 30 years. Indeed, it was a theory that was espoused 30 years ago and led to a congressional statute in anticipation one day that Roe versus Wade might be overturned. So let's take a look at that. And I get this from a Washington Post article that was published this past May. And in this article, it talks about the question: might the Constitution guarantee abortion access as a First Amendment religious right? That was the thesis, the question being asked in this article. And it said, many Americans are surprised by the notion that a religious tradition could permit or even mandate the termination of a pregnancy. They assume all religions endorse the conservative Christian view that life begins at conception, rendering abortion akin to murder. But this isn't the consensus of all Christians, and neither Jewish nor Muslim traditions share this belief. One has leaders, one finds leaders within all three religions who affirm the ethics of abortion. And now I'm not the arbiter on Jewish law. We can always ask a rabbi. But it says Jewish law actually requires abortion in some situations. Most consistently in a case where a pregnancy endangers the life of the person carrying it. The past 30 years have witnessed tremendous successful efforts to strengthen the First Amendment's guarantee of the free exercise of religion. In theory, this should open up new pathways to secure access to abortion. But considering the record of the current Supreme Court, it is hard to imagine that their enthusiasm for the First Amendment will extend to those whose traditions support reproductive rights. Now, we're going to continue on to the end of the article, where the postulation is that although this court has been expanding First Amendment rights, look at the ability of the coach to pray at midfield, freedom of religion. Look at, there are other examples, but although they've been expanding the First Amendment, is that constitutional prerogative going to extend to a challenge to abortion? Probably not. And there they will be in conflict with themselves. We're gonna have to see how that works out. And there are suits that are already filed. I'm going to get to that. But first, I want to give a personal example of how this actually comes up and how it troubles people. I want this to become real, if I can, for you folks. Back in, let's say 2002, my then wife and I wanted to start a family. And it wasn't happening. So we were referred to a reproductive endocrinologist. And they did some testing. And there were some issues on my wife's side. And they said, okay, well, let's try artificial insemination. Not very expensive, certainly not covered by insurance. And not terribly expensive. So we tried, I think it was 3 rounds of artificial insemination. Didn't work. So we're next told there's a procedure, which we'd never heard of, much more common now, called in vitro fertilization, where they extract from my emissions and they implant it in essentially a test tube or a petri dish where they've taken something out of my wife. And then they look to see which ones seem to develop the best. And they take the best 3 or 4 and they then implant them into my wife to see if they'll continue to develop. And before they do this, we have a little office meeting, and the doctor says to us, most likely, if any of them take, it'll be one of them. However, we have to warn you that the more we implant, the more likely one will take. But the more we implant, the more likely several will take. Twins, triplets, quadruplets, quintuplets, sextuplets. Had to tell us about that risk. And he says, if that happens, you may face the question of selective reduction. What is selective reduction? A very clinical term for abortion. And as my wife and I drove back home, we were confronted by a really intensely difficult issue. We now had to consider, we were both pro-choice, but we now had to consider, how did we feel personally? And in part, we wanted to know, what are our religious faith? What were its precepts on abortion? And we went to our rabbi, not the current rabbi I have, but we went to a previous rabbi. And we were essentially told that if it endangers the life of the mother, or it endangers the life of another fetus, Judaism permits the ending of, one fetus or more. Okay, so we went home, and we're now faced with the knowledge our religious faith does not prevent us from proceeding. What do we do? What are our personal views on abortion? Notwithstanding our political views, that every woman has the right to make her own decision. What are our personal views? And we came not too hard to the determination that we were both against abortion for ourselves. We didn't believe in it. And so now what do? Do we proceed with the IVF and risk that we may be faced with having to authorize an abortion or having a whole bunch of children? And do we hope for the best that maybe it's just one or two? And we really struggle with, well, if we don't do this, then our only avenue to having kids is adoption. And we looked into adoption heavily, what it entailed, how much it cost. And ultimately, we told the reproductive endocrinologist that we were prepared to proceed. Now, let me tell you something. Back then, I don't know what it is now, that was expensive. Very, very, very expensive and not covered by insurance. And we were told there's no likelihood of success. There's a possibility of success. And we had gone through 3 artificial inseminations which failed. So now are we going to pay 20 grand just to fail? Wow. Well, we did it. And we got my son out of it. And fortunately for us, it was only one that took once it was implanted. And we tried another round later on. And that 20 grand was for naught, because nothing took. And that ended our effort because of the cost. So we ended up having one child. But these are very personal decisions. And they involve not only your personal decisions, but they involve your own religious faith and what your beliefs are. And I'm sorry, you cannot tell me what to believe. I don't care if you're Christian or Jewish. It doesn't even matter to me if the rabbi disagrees with me. It's my faith, it's my beliefs. It's my version of Judaism. It's what I accept. And the same for you. And in fact, that's what the Supreme Court says. And we're going to get into that. But that's exactly what the Supreme Court says. And how its future approach to this question will probably cause a constitutional crisis within the court, because it's probably not going to be true to itself. I believe it's going to expose itself as hypocritical. Anyway, the Washington Post article continued on. The past 30 years have witnessed tremendous successful efforts to strengthen the First Amendment's guarantee of the free exercise of religion. In theory, this should open up new pathways to secure access to abortion. But considering the record of the current court, it's hard to imagine their enthusiasm. In the spring of 1991, the National Right to Life Committee, the Concerned Women for America, the Missouri Synod of the Lutheran Church, and the National Conference of Catholic Bishops refused to support an act called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, unless it included an amendment making it abortion neutral. Now, this was an act that was proposed by a Republican and a Democrat following the 1990 decision of the Supreme Court in Employment Division versus Smith, which decided in favor of Oregon's Department of Human Resources when it fired 2 Native American employees who had ingested peyote as part of a religious service. And the court determined that it was acceptable for Oregon to criminalize peyote without violating the Native Americans' First Amendment rights, and despite disadvantaging religious minorities. The court said these were unavoidable consequences of governing a cosmopolitan nation made up of people of almost every conceivable religious preference. So Congress proposed a statute, Republicans and Democrats, and it was prepared to pass until all these variations of Christian groups attacked it and wanted an abortion neutral amendment because they didn't want any way, shape, or form that it implied you could have a First Amendment right to abortion. Well, that almost scuttled the bipartisan act. And indeed, the act only passed with a, stripped down version of the amendment, which the supporters argued still wasn't neutral. Indeed, they were arguing that instead of offering neutrality, the proposed amendment threatened to transform Religious Freedom Restoration Act into a discriminatory statute. And they insisted on it not being amended in that way. And they figured, were anti-abortion activists really going to risk the religious freedom of all Americans that would be provided as a result of that statute on the remote possibility that this law, under the then unlikely scenario that Roe would be overturned, might also strengthen abortion access? They were surprised. The answer was yes. They were willing to threaten the passage of the act. 30 years ago, lawyers for the National Right to Life Committee were already playing the long game, undercutting potential legal avenues that might continue to support abortion access in the event Roe v. Wade was overturned. They were working on this from the get-go. So in the 30 years since passage of a watered-down Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which wasn't neutral to reproductive freedom, the Supreme Court has had occasion to rule on several religious types of cases. In 2014, in Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, the Hobby Lobby Corporation wanted to opt out of covering contraception for their employees under the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. The court permitted it, and additional exemptions were provided in the later case of Little Sister of the Poor versus Pennsylvania and Trump versus Pennsylvania in 2020. Thousands lost birth control coverage. So, if Roe is overturned, as it is, this was written in May, before it was, it is said that it's likely that a Jewish or a Muslim person denied a religiously mandated abortion will sue their home state for violating their religious freedom. And now here's the interesting part of the article, the ending. And then we're going to talk about what's really happening. The ending is, if this happens, ideally the argument would carry a lot of weight. After all, since the installation of Justice Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court has been drastically expanding free exercise exemptions under the First Amendment and granting a remarkable proportion of claims. The Tandem versus Newsom case, for instance, declared COVID-era public health restrictions on religious gatherings to be an infringement of the First Amendment rights. As the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia has argued, the court's recent opinions have created a hierarchy of constitutional rights, with religious rights at the top. So, should the Supreme Court deny a First Amendment right to abortion, it would expose the limits of its commitment to religious freedom. it would send a message to members of religious minorities and anyone with a uterus that the protections of the First Amendment do not apply to them, at least not when they try to make reproductive decisions informed by religious conscience. And again, did you have something you want to say, Greg?
No, I'm good. This is fascinating.
Okay, well, so with all this in mind and all this theoretical, how would it work and what would happen? And, you know, can the First Amendment actually be a vehicle to obtain abortion rights? Even in a state that says no abortions at all, not even in the case of incest or rape. And I too wondered about that. I had not really thought of the First Amendment as a vehicle until somebody whispered it in my ear, and I did a little bit of this research. And I found out something fascinating. A synagogue in South Florida, in West Palm Beach, has already filed suit to block legislation in Florida that would ban, and the statute passed, so it does ban, and yesterday the Third District Court of Appeal placed an injunction on the statute which bans abortions, I think after 15 weeks it was. So before that happened, earlier in the month, a South Florida synagogue filed a lawsuit to block that legislation, arguing that it violated the state constitution's right to freedom of religion. Wow. Well, it was Rabbi Barry Silver who brought the suit on behalf of Congregation Lador Vador, which he leads, and said that his goal was not just to send a message, but to carve out protections for Jews in states where abortion is outlawed. It's not just to make a point or something, Silver said in an interview. It's deadly serious. Now, Rabbi Silver, whose congregation is ultra reform, so let's say very left on the scale as compared to like ultra Orthodox Jews on the right, who oddly enough have the same perspective on this point. And the point is that, again, the rabbi could speak better to this for her perspective, but the point that they both espouse is that Judaism doesn't just permit an abortion in situations where the mother's life is in danger, or let's say another fetus is in danger, that Judaism compels an abortion in those situations. So therefore, it's part of religious faith that an abortion be had. Now, does any Jew believe in every single aspect of Judaism? No. Do all Jews avoid pork? No. Do all Jews observe the Sabbath? No. But that doesn't mean that every Jew and every Christian and every Muslim and everything else have their own conglomeration of aspects of their religion that matter to them and that they practice. So a Jew or a Muslim or certain Christians that would say, I need to have an abortion because my religion does not allow me to continue this pregnancy for this reason. Or my religion permits me to have an abortion for this reason. What inquiry is the court allowed in order to stop you from having that abortion? Is any inquiry allowed? Now, a rabbi in New Orleans said that his experience in appealing to conservatives who sought to ban abortion 32 years ago may be instructive for the Jewish leaders making the same argument today. In other words, let's say Rabbi Silver from the West Palm Beach congregation. And another scholar, a conservative constitutional scholar, Josh Blackman, wrote this past Monday in the Washington Post that, like those who belong to Silver's Florida synagogue, others have a weak legal case when it comes to abortion because they do not follow other forms of halacha, of Jewish law. And he said, quote, if virtually every other facet of halacha is not binding on members of this congregation, how could it be that this one teaching on abortion is binding, so binding, that a state's prohibition of that teaching actually substantially burdens the free exercise of religion? Oh my goodness, he just screwed up Supreme Court law like you can't believe. Really, it's gone so fast. All right, well, let me just say that, as I said before, it doesn't matter if you don't follow all these other things. What matters is, do you believe in this aspect of your religion? If you do, the court is not allowed to inquire if there's a substantial burden on you. It can only inquire, is there a compelling state interest that uses the least narrow or the most narrow means necessary to interfere with your religious belief. And clearly, with the minutes we have left, we don't have the time, but there's a 2019 case in the Supreme Court, Little Sisters of the Poor versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And in that case, what the Supreme Court determined was that the Third Circuit was wrong when it went into an inquiry of substantial burden on a religious belief. And that the only inquiry they can make is it a sincere belief? And in what time I have left, I'll say, this is from that Supreme Court opinion. The court has repeatedly and uniformly admonished that the First Amendment prohibits courts from acting as ecclesiastical, I mispronounced that word, tribunals, judging the reasonableness or orthodoxy of an organization's or person's religious beliefs. It is not within the judicial function and judicial competence to inquire whether someone who has religious qualms with a law has correctly perceived the commands of his faith. And it says that if left unchecked, the Third Circuit's decision will place courts nationwide in a position to determine as a matter of law whether the religious beliefs of the parties before them are not only sincerely held, but also, in the court's view, reasonable. Court is not allowed to determine whether it's reasonable, only whether it's sincerely held. Civil courts have no judicial role in such an evaluation under the First Amendment. The court's decisions confine judicial review of whether an adherent's religious beliefs prohibit compliance with the government regulation to the narrow function of inquiring whether those beliefs reflect an honest conviction, sincerely held. Once a court determines that an objector sincerely believes that some government mandated action or prohibition is contrary to his or her religious beliefs, the only burden question for the court is whether a substantial government sanction, like preventing abortion, attaches to disobedience of the law? If so, the substantial burden inquiry ends there. So, based upon that Supreme Court case, one would think that when faced with this one day, the Supreme Court would find that it is improper to prevent an abortion to somebody who asserts that they sincerely believe in this aspect of their religious faith. Because the court in other areas has been expanding First Amendment free speech and free belief claims. However, do we all agree? This court is not going to do that. This court's not going to say, yes, there's a religious exception to get an abortion if you have a sincere belief in that aspect of your religious faith. No, the court is going to probably prove itself hypocritical in expanding it everywhere else, but not for abortion. And why do I say that? Because with the decision to overrule Roe versus Wade, I have completely lost faith in the Supreme Court, something I have never felt in my entire life, in my entire career of practicing law, where I sat on the steps of the Supreme Court before my first day in law school, pondering what my career would be. So that's it for Ask a Lawyer, and see you next week. And hopefully there aren't big bombshells this coming week. Take care, goodbye, and have a wonderful week.
WPSL, Port St. Lucie, WSTU Stewart.
I'm Steve Kathan. Travel woes threaten a holiday weekend. Already there have been dozens of flight cancellations, more than 1,000 delays at the country's airports. This woman in Philadelphia is trying to get to Kansas City.
Actually, it was supposed to fly out yesterday and it got canceled. So I'm a little anxious about what's going to happen today.
Millions